This is the inaugural Kernza Cafe Chat series, kind of designed for growers of Kernza and interested growers of Kernza in the upper Midwest. Obviously, we have a much wider net of folks here, so we're certainly happy to have everybody along from wherever you're calling in from today. But before we get started here, I just give a little lay of the land about how we got here and what we're doing. So that's me. We're both myself and my colleague Sienna Nesser, who's online here, helping with some of the back end and communication and whatnot, are putting together this kind of more hopefully informal Kernza webinar series that have kind of been informed by some common questions that I've received from the field from Kernza growers and interested folks. So both Sienna and myself are part of the Forever Green Initiative. If you're not familiar with that, we're kind of a research and commercialization arm based within the University of Minnesota, doing breeding and kind of outreach and commercialization work on new and novel cropping systems for the upper Midwest. And Kernza is one of the crops we've been working with along with the team from the Land Institute. And we hope this will kind of set the stage for more grower-to-grower interaction. You know, this is a brand new series here, so the format's still a little bit in flux, but we're gonna at least give half this hour to guest speakers that we've invited, and then would welcome your feedback and communication online, and ask questions as they come up, and feel free to, you know, share your contact information in the chat if you'd like to connect more. And we hope that this will be kind of a bedrock to step off of for some in-season field days, whether that's, you know, some kind of informal meetups in the field or, you know, more Zoom meetings, whatever people are interested in. But hopefully this is valuable, and definitely open to your feedback if you have any as we kind of go through this here. So just as a call out too, we've got 5 different talks in this series. Again, all kind of informed about common Kernza questions that have come up. I started with the Forever Green Initiative as the agronomist about a year ago this time, and you know, the questions have all kind of more or less fit into these 5 buckets, but this is a good place to start some of these conversations here. And I think none of these topics should come as any surprise to people that have, you know, spent some time with Kernza, or maybe have kind of thought through the specifics, but maybe haven't planted as yet. So today we've got Lee DeHaan from the Land Institute kind of kicking things off of our series, talking about kind of the history and current situation on Kernza. Next, we're going to have Prabin from the University of Minnesota, who's our perennial grains breeder, give a little update on what's happening with variety development, kind of specifically in the upper Midwest. And then another colleague from Forever Green, Director of Adoption and Scaling, Colin Cureton, is going to give a little background on what's happened with Kernza kind of in the upper Midwest commercialization space in the last 4 to 5 years. So just to emphasize the point again, this is ideally targeted to Kernza growers and interested growers. Like I said before, we're certainly happy to invite and have people, kind of partners and other folks that are interested in the crop join in these series, but would just respectfully ask if at all possible to kind of give as much airtime as possible for growers to ask questions and talk as we go through here. So we hope that this will be a good forum for folks to ask questions. And also, as you're thinking about you know, future asks from the University of Minnesota, we want this to be responsive to your needs and, you know, to meet your goals. So whatever that looks like to you, we want to hear about it, whether that's future get-togethers in season, if you need educational materials, field days, if this is informing a research question you'd like to reach out to us about, we want to be responsive to that. So please think through that as we're kind of going through the next handful of months here with this series. So with that, I will pass things over to Lee DeHaan to kick us off with this. You should be able to share screen.
Okay, share mine now. No, it says I can't. Well, someone else is.
I will
You just have to stop, yeah.
There we go. How's that?
All right, now I'll give it a shot. Share that one, and it'll hopefully hit this. Oh, come on. There we go. Did that work at all?
I can see your, oh, there we go. Now
Yes,
it's up.
looks good.
All right, awesome. Okay, so I was asked to talk a little bit about the history of Kernza grain breeding. I happen to see that Peggy Wagner is on as appropriate, so she can answer even more of your questions about the history, because I'm starting off with a slide showing the Rodale Institute on the bottom right, where Peggy began the work in the 1980s under the vision of trying to create a perennial grain through domestication of a perennial grass. They searched for a promising species, selected intermediate wheatgrass, and began that work. In the upper left is the Plant Materials Center in Big Flats, New York, when it was in its early days. It was tasked with finding new species to use, especially for enhancing the agriculture and shelter belts and such. And the work after the 1980s moved there for the next 10 years or so, selecting for improved grain quality traits, bigger seed, higher quality seed, ease of threshing, etc. I would put up a timeline here. It starts in the 1932 on the left-hand side, where intermediate wheatgrass is not native to the United States. It first came from the Caucasus region. A lot of the collections are from Turkey, Iran, southern Russia, all the way over to Kazakhstan. Those accessions have been brought to the U.S., used as forage, and Peggy went through a great deal of work to try to get as much of the available collections for evaluation in Pennsylvania when they got started. So yeah, so going down to this phase here of breeding, and then starting about 2000, materials were transferred from that program over to the Lyme Institute. I came here in 2001 and initiated a breeding program using basically traditional approaches of growing out thousands of plants, selecting the most promising ones after evaluating their traits, such as the plant height, diseases, seed size, shatter resistance, threshability, lodging resistance, to try to improve the use of this species for grain production. Since 2010, 11, began to share my selections with other organizations and universities. Minnesota, Manitoba first. I see Steve Larson at Utah is on the call. Also, there's been programs started in Sweden, and there's been sharing of improved germplasm with many countries in Europe and Asia and even Northern Africa. So there's been quite a distribution of improved materials, and we're continuing to improve the way that we go about our selections, trying to make faster and faster progress using genome sequencing and genotyping to do faster improvement. I think Prabin will go a little bit more into the current techniques. I wanted to just to shift gears and do something kind of strange for a couple minutes and answer the question sort of, where are we? How do we think about where we're at in the development of this crop? So I like to put up this slide, which is of Kitty Hawk, obviously, in 1903, when the first sustained flight happened. And I often say that our Kitty Hawk event was when we planted this 30-acre field of some of my improved materials near or in central Kansas. And the farmer, Charlie Melander, was able to use his combine to harvest this 30 acres. And then we said, what are we going to do with it? Well, he said, my truck's empty now, wheat's done. So we threw it in his truck, and then we had to figure out something to do with it. We hauled it out to a mill in western Kansas. We made thousands of pounds of flour, began to make things out of it that tasted good. And that kind of was our moment of saying, hey, this could actually kind of work. I know Peggy probably had that moment at a different time, but this was my moment of saying this might work. And this was in 2010, or 2009 or 10. So how does that line up with aviation? So just for perspective, 1903 first flight. We're down to like the first commercial flights weren't until almost 20 years later, 22 years later. And commercial transatlantic flights that are competing with ships wasn't for another 35 and really 55 years later before flying was as good as taking a ship across the ocean. So how do I see Kernza like lining up with that? So we have that first harvest. 6 years later, we had some small commercial selling of the products. And then 11 years, we had the General Mills product. The Long Root Ale was in 2017. Was kind of a really changing point to having the first widely marketed product. And there's been other ones that have come since then. But really, I think our timeline until we have something that's really like wheat. Sometimes people think that, well, this is a crop and everyone's ready to go for it. Actually, there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unknowns yet, and a couple more slides just of aviation to show you kind of where I think we're at. So 1907, people were trying planes that looked like this. 1910, they looked like this, and 12 looked like this, and this one's in 1921, so almost 20 years after the first flight. And this one was a catastrophic flight. And I like the quote here that the maker of this boat plane said, "One must not be shocked if one wants to progress. The path of progress is strewn with suffering." So there's plenty of suffering as we worked out flight, and we're in the same phase, I think, of a lot of suffering in any new crop is going to go through that same sort of really challenging time. The USSR made this crazy plane that they forgot about vibrations, and the whole thing vibrated to pieces and crashed, killing everyone on board. So many crashes, hundreds of people driving experimental flights. Fortunately, our work isn't life-threatening, we hope, but there's plenty of risk. And so, what lessons might we learn? I've got a few here. So when you try something really new, the old ways are going to be safer and easier, even if there's great potential. And people were so excited about flight, they risked their necks over and over again. And many gave their lives for the exciting potential. And I see that same kind of excitement. People learn about Kernza, they're willing to take risks. And that's great. We need those risk takers in these early years. And we need to be prepared for those instances of suffering when things don't go well, because at this point, there's going to be a lot of those. But if at all possible, we need to protect the risk takers to some extent. We can't protect them entirely because that would create a bubble. I think if there was no risk, everyone would jump into it and it would be an even greater catastrophe. So we can't alleviate all risk, but we should avoid or find some way to alleviate risk for those who are willing to get in early and work out the bugs for everyone who will come along after them. We're going to have a lot of crazy ideas, just like those planes with 35 wings on them. People are going to have to try a lot of stuff, and it's going to take more than researchers necessarily. Things on farm are great, but research stations have a lot of value. We can make mistakes there, so the farmers don't necessarily have to make them. And I think we should hear ideas coming from everyone, including the farmers, and we need to try a lot of new ideas to find ways to do this better and hopefully get to success. So that goes a little bit beyond breeding, but that's kind of where I'm seeing the crop is, and the kind of message I try to share with farmers is that this isn't a off the shelf ready crop for you to walk out with a manual and have success tomorrow. There's a lot of you're at the early days, you're at the exciting phase, you're a risk taker and breaking a new path, and if that's the kind of person you are, this is the kind of crop for you. All right, that's all I've got. If I can stop my sharing.
Great, thanks, Lee. Appreciate that. Kind of a good mental model to think about as we're kind of proceeding forward here with that. So next up, I'm going to pass things over to, well, I guess before we do that, any questions for Lee outstanding here before we pass it over to kind of another quick talk here? Feel free to unmute or type your question in the chat if you'd rather not.
Did they figure out the plane engineering, Lee?
Obviously they did.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up, protecting the risk takers or risk mitigation. I have kind of a relevant point to that I'll bring up after we're done with all the talks here, but that's definitely worthwhile to talk about. And something that I think we at Forever Green have been thinking a lot about for Kernza growers in the state of Minnesota to kind of help mitigate the risk of jumping into kind of a new and emerging crop space. But I'll go into that a little bit more in detail later. Prabin, I will pass things over to you to kind of give it more of a Midwest focus to what Lee kind of framed up for us.
Sounds good. Hope you can see and hear me well. Can
see and hear you.
I need to hop off at 1:30, so I'll try to make it brief. If there's any questions, there's Lee, Steve, and Peggy, so they got it all covered in case there's questions in terms of breeding. I'll just give a quick overview of what's happening, especially at the University of Minnesota, but this probably also broadly applies to other breeding programs. Here are the main breeding goals. Lee mentioned already some of the traits, but obviously we want to increase grain yield. I have sustained grain yield there. We don't shy away from the fact that we see yield decline, especially in year 3 in Minnesota and possibly other Midwest states. So we are working towards that as well. Want to improve seed size, shatter resistance, increase free threshing, and other traits. Also important, especially for Minnesota, are lodging resistance and optimal height, where we do tend to get plants that are a bit taller because of our cooler weather, although the past 3 summers have been pretty hot. And I also select for disease resistance, especially scab and ergot. The breeders don't directly select plants for end-use quality and food products, but especially here we work with faculty members in the Department of Food Sciences to evaluate the materials, especially variety candidates, and identify how they're performing and what kind of nutritional composition they have, and make some inferences based on that. Here's an overview of how we do things, and this again broadly applies to other breeding programs with maybe some small changes and how fast or how slow it works. If you want to follow me along, let's start right here. This training population is a selection population essentially that's out in the field. 2 sites for us for 2 years at least, sometimes 3. We collect trait data. Again, all of the traits I mentioned earlier, and we genotype, which basically is getting DNA fingerprint information on the population. And we put that trait data from 2 locations, 2 years, and the DNA fingerprint data together with very smart algorithms, statistical models that can help you predict on populations that are larger, like here, breeding population that never sees the field. But the same model can predict how they might do. So based on that, you select the plants that are predicted to perform the best. And while it might sound a little crazy, it does work for the most part. There are some traits that don't work as well, but for others, they work quite good. And then from the selected subset, you can either make crosses in the greenhouse, as you can see, that's what we do here at the University of Minnesota, make crosses in the greenhouse, and then grow them out, reselect, put them in the field, and so on. So that's the population improvement portion of breeding. Also from the plants in the field, or from this population that's just predicted, depending on how you're designing a breeding program, you can pick the best of the best, so to speak, cross them either in the greenhouse or in the field, and do some seed increases, put them in variety trials for X number of years, and select the best 1 or 2 and decide which one you want to release and how long. We released them in Clearwater in 2019. The Land Institute has done some private releases, And we are approaching release of the second cultivar, and we're looking at either the end of this year or next year, depending on how things go this summer, 2024 summer. So that's the overall view of the breeding program and how the operations work. And using this model of genomic selection and prediction, we have been able to improve the traits, some quite dramatically. For example, on the very left, I have shattering at top and free threshing at the bottom. Shattering is a trait that if you're going with the combine to harvest your plots, you might see some spikeless shattering. Sometimes the spikes breaking. We want to avoid that, so to not lose the yield in the field. And at the same time, we want higher free threshing, meaning as much dehulled grain as possible coming out of the combine or a thresher, so that post-processing work is a little easier. And on both of these, so we want shattering to go down or shatter resistance to increase and free threshing to increase. And both of these are happening at a very, very fast pace, about 15 to 17% each breeding cycle. And then you come on the right-hand side here, seed size, which is also a very important domestication trait, one of our main targets. It's a little slower. There is progress in the positive direction, but a little slower progress in that. Plant height, it's up and down. Plant height is positively and significantly correlated with grain yield, especially in Minnesota. So if you pick for, say, a dwarf wheatgrass plant, that might have really pathetic yield, so we don't want that. But if it's too tall, it might lodge and just flop over in the field. So you have to be kind of careful at what the best situation is and select plants accordingly. But overall, we're slowing or reducing plant height slightly with each breeding cycle. We are making progress in grain yield as well, but it's a little different kind of situation. I took over the breeding program here at the university with cycle 3, and since then we've standardized the data collection and cleaning procedure. So if you look from cycle 3 and beyond, we're increasing grain yield at about, I think, 11 or 12% each cycle. I really don't want to talk a whole lot about the previous 2 cycles because I was not here, but from cycle 3 and onwards, we are making progress. This plot on the right, I threw it in here to show you year 1 versus year 2 differences, as well as location differences. There's a lot that happens when the same plant is planted at 2 different locations and also in 2 different years. The effect of the environment, the soil, and everything else, that the combination of that, it affects yield quite a bit, affects other traits as well. Seed size I've seen being affected quite a bit with the ongoing heat the past 3 seasons. I thought I was making good progress, and then all of a sudden the summer is super hot and the seed size actually goes in the other direction. So it's a challenge that you have to work with. But overall, things look pretty good. I do agree with Lee that we're in a challenging phase, but the directions do point towards positive growth and progress. So all the progress that's made in terms of improving trait, improving the population, that goes into developing varieties. And then the way we do populations is by selecting 10 to 15 best out of 700, 800 individuals. They're cloned, meaning basically cut into 2, 3, 4 pieces and planted in this kind of configuration, which is what we call crossing block. So in this particular block, there might be plants that are the best in yield and seed size and absolutely no shatter. And there might be another block right next to it, somewhere hidden on the left of the figure, the photo here, that might be also best in grain yield, but instead of 0 shatter, it might have 100% free threshing and so on. So different combinations. And I have some examples to show later. You can see tall winter rye variety planted all around to minimize pollen contamination between the crossing blocks, to keep each variety candidate sort of pure, so to speak. In terms of numbers, we at the university here have developed about 35. So from cycle 1 to cycle 5, there have been 35 candidates. MN Clearwater came again from cycle 1. The next variety might come from cycle 2, but most likely cycle 3 if we want to wait out a couple more years. And starting with cycle 6, which is our current cycle, I am trying to increase the number a little bit. So instead of 6 or 8 each cycle, maybe do up to a dozen. And that way we have more candidates to test, evaluate, and pick the best from. Speaking of upcoming varieties, we have some in the pipeline that are very good at free threshing. These are the MN19 candidates. The MN1902 here in particular, it's pretty good, 90% or so free threshing, I would call it. And these came out of a direct combine. I think we use the Zern 500 in the field, and then just cleaned it using this vertical cleaner with appropriate sieves. I have the clean out percent somewhere, probably 25% was the rate, but pretty exciting. I have 1 year yield performance data on MN19s compared to other previous candidates. It's just 1 year data, so can't make bold predictions just based on that, but it looks promising. That's all I'm going to say without sharing any details. How were the MN19s selected? So MN1902, the one I showed, so this one right here, that is right over here, was selected for large seed site and high threshability, was close to 100%, not quite 100%, and that shows 1904 here actually was selected for near 100% free threshing, and if you go back and look at it, it's a second in terms of my ranking, and it's what we see in the field, that combination of best of the best, that method, it works basically is what I'm trying to say here. And 1905 had absolutely no shatter, decent yield, and etc. So these all are in second year variety trials in 2024. So we will get more information this summer. Again, along the same vein, we have more candidates each year. Some for near 100% threshing, some for 0% shatter, and so on. Sorry, yeah, this was supposed to go in the back here. Just looking at the timeline of variety development, it takes a while, especially here where we have 1-to-1 growing season a year. So if I start with the crossing block with the picture I showed with those random parents in year 1, going from seed increase to variety trials to additional seed increase to accumulate enough to actually make it a public release takes somewhere from 6 to 8 years. The wheatgrass has a long life cycle. Many of you know that who work with the crop, you plant in the fall and you don't harvest until early mid-August, so about 11 months or so. We are thinking about maybe selecting for early heading, early flowering. It kind of syncs with the winter rye kind of timeline in terms of maturity and harvest. But we'll see how far, what kind of progress we can make there. But yeah, just like Lee said earlier, I also thank all the farmers, growers who've been bold enough and crazy enough to help us, work with us. We really, truly appreciate your involvement as we continue to develop this crop. That's all I have, Matt. I don't know if there's any time for questions. I'm going to stop.
Yeah, thank you so much for being. Appreciate that. We did have a question that I can maybe punt to both of you. On the chat here. So all Kernza breeding programs are run under conventional ag production systems. I'm assuming that's true for both of Land Institute and U of M. And people that are growing it, obviously they have seen the most market uptake from kind of organic and regenerative organic production. So what are kind of the, what's the framework for translating breeding under conventional production systems and kind of translating that to certified organic production, and maybe why or why not do you do organic breeding?
Yeah, I can answer or try to answer. So, sorry, my camera stops all the time, so it's going to stay off now. So at this point, in terms of the investment of resources, it doesn't seem like the best way to go, partly because of the difference in what you're selecting on in an early domestication phase versus fine-tuning out of modern crops. So if you're looking at modern corn varieties and you're trying to select under organic production. You can find differences by evaluating a bunch of corn varieties that are out there, because you're slicing it really thin amongst all extremely high yielding, highly domesticated varieties. In the case of starting from scratch with something that's very wild and bringing it into some sort of near domestication, there's so much to be done just on things like Prabin just talked about, free threshing and non-shattering it. Those things don't matter what kind of production system you really have them in. Seed size similar, it's very consistent across, no matter how we grow it. It's quite consistent, and so once you start getting into yield, now you have a lot of G-body and things, and so certain yield traits you could probably find some justification, but just among environments, year to year rainfall and soil types, there's so much interaction going on there that slicing it thinner down to the type of fertilization regime used and things like that is going to result in very small differences in progress. And under breeding, you're most often trying to reduce the variability within a field and ensure that you can control what the environment is in that field. And therefore, we tend to use not necessarily conventional approaches. It's not really conventional or organic approaches. It's a breeding environment, which is doesn't fit either definition really. For instance, a lot of my breeding plots don't have synthetic fertilizers applied to them, at least for the first few years, and they might not have any herbicides used, but there's tillage being done, but it's just not like any kind of real production environment. So that's the reality that we're in at this point. Once you get a highly refined crop where your yield is pushing the edge of what's possible, now you're going to want to get down to those fine details of exactly how is it being grown, and you can start breeding for those really refinements. But at this point, it's not likely that it's going to make a difference.
Yeah, thanks for that. And Prabin had to drop off for another meeting, but yeah, I mean, I guess I have some experience coming from the commercial seed industry for a dozen years or so, and I would say even with well-developed crops, there's a definite lack of breeding work specifically done on even organic corn, for example, and that's one of the largest planted crops across the upper Midwest, and it kind of hinges on that specific point of minimizing variability, because if there can be a lot of confounding factors of breeding organic genetics on certified organic ground, differences in fertility, differences in weed pressure, and that makes the data set extremely noisy and hard to pick out or detect actual differences between varieties. So, a lot of times, conventional production, methods, while not perfect, do minimize variability that way. It's just kind of my own 2 cents there. Well, okay, great. Now we're going to give things even more of a Midwest focus, and I'm going to pass things off to my colleague, Colin Cureton, Director of Adoption and Scaling with UMN for Evergreen, to kind of give us a little history on what's happened with Kernza in the upper Midwest in the last 5 to 6 years. So Colin, take it away.
Thanks, Matt. And hello, everyone. I'm going to try to do that really briefly. I have to flee out of here in about 10 minutes, actually, for another meeting. But the first thing I want to say is that Lee's comments about flight and the development of flight as kind of a technological pathway really resonate with me. I have often used the analogy for Kernza and other new perennial and winter annual crops. I've used the framework of renewable energy as a technology portfolio that is on a long-term development curve to to transition systems. And I think that's a really helpful way to think about where we're at. I'd say we're still in the early phase of that curve, but we've made some progress. And I'm going to give you a quick sketch on how that's looked in the upper Midwest. I'll try to. So the first thing I want to say is that it was and is a very wide coalition of partners that have been involved in what you could call Kitty Hawk, the Upper Midwest edition, in trying to bring Kernza to its early market uses. And so this wide coalition, I just want to acknowledge partners like Greenland's Blue Waters, MISA, the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture, and a number, dozens of market partners spanning, groups like the Birchwood Cafe and Bang Brewing, all the way up to General Mills, have been involved in this journey. And so I think the Upper Midwest has both kind of high social capital, a major agricultural, region, as well as pretty severe issues related to soil health and water quality that has made us a laboratory of sorts for innovation, both on the scientific end and on the commercial end. So I just want to acknowledge that wide range of partners that's involved. None of this is happening like independently or alone. And that's really important for other regions that are building their capacity to advance Kernza perennial grain. My involvement formally with Kernza started in 2019, where following the first phase of work with that larger coalition, the University of Minnesota, in conjunction with the Land Institute, made essentially strategic hires for commercialization teams to work on bridging these early innovations in the breeding and agronomy programs out into the market. Just a reminder, I'm not sure, Matt, if you covered this, Forever Green as a whole, the University of Minnesota Forever Green Initiative is developing, similar to the Land Institute, with some differences, a suite of new perennial as well as winter annual crop opportunities for the Upper Midwest to diversify, to strengthen and diversify our agricultural systems. So Kernza is one of those 15, and it's kind of leading the charge. So we've been staffing up on the commercialization front since about 2019. And that work was essentially, my first work on the job was really licensing and deploying the first round of MN Clearwater seed that came out of Jim Anderson and Prabin's breeding program. And so I joined as a supply chain development specialist, and essentially for the first 3 years, really focused on establishing a reliable supply of Kernza perennial seed and grain. And I'm happy to share that I think we've actually done that fairly effectively on the supply side. Just to paint a quick picture of what our team looks like now, I want you to know that we're a resource to everyone on this call. So our commercialization, adoption, and scaling team includes Matt Leavitt as our perennial grains and winter annuals agronomist. He's a resource to all of you. Call him. We also employ a continuous living cover adoption specialist. Her name is Sienna. She's also on the call. And I assume some of the programs that she and Matt deploy will be covered in this series, specifically the ECO program. We also have recently hired a product and market development specialist that is happy to work with folks in the value chain and market side of this work on product and market development. And we also have an associate. And so this growing team spanning the Forever Green Initiative portfolio is here as a resource to you all to adopt Kernza on your farms and also help move it into the market. The few things that I want to share in my remaining time are the basics of how Kernza growers go about becoming licensed Kernza growers by the Land Institute, give you a very short kind of market progress update, a little bit of a, let's call it a micro market outlook, and then I'll close. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully effectively. Bear with me. Okay, there we go. And so these basic steps apply to becoming a licensed Kernza grower. Just quick reminder, Kernza is a trademark name in the marketplace. It is not a crop name. The species you're growing is intermediate wheatgrass. They're improved varieties for grain production, but the species is intermediate wheatgrass. And so there's a trademark program in place that Lee could give you more of the history on, but essentially this guarantees some quality standards in the marketplace, a common message similar to, say, Kamut, for example. And we always, hope for the best but plan for the worst. and there have been bad actors that, for example, could take intermediate wheatgrass seed, for forage production, try to sell it as a high value food crop, and that could undermine all the Kernza growers trying to build the market for this. So the Land Institute owns and operates the Kernza trademark program. The first step to becoming a licensed grower is, first of all, before you apply, I would say do your homework. So call Matt, utilize these resources. But then if you're ready, a great resource for you is kernza.org. You go to kernza.org, and there is under resources, a page for growers. You can go to that. You can learn more about why there's a trademark to market this grain in the marketplace. And if you feel like you're ready, you can go to apply to grow Kernza. There's a Kernza grower application right there, Kernza grower 2024 application. You're going to click on that, fill out that basic information. And that information, if you're in Minnesota or nearby in the upper Midwest, that application is going to be forwarded to our team, and specifically Matt. Chances are that Matt's going to reach out to you and have a talk about how this fits in your rotation. Have you thought about X? Have you thought about Y? Just to share, we've had about 400 people apply to grow Kernza in the last 4 years. And I think about 80 of them have decided to plant, that they were ready to plant. So I really encourage you to utilize the resources that are available to you, both the technical resources, the written documents, the recordings, as well as the human capacity that's available. The next thing you're going to do is go through that licensing process. That application will either be approved or not by Matt if we're in Minnesota. If you're elsewhere in the country, that application will go to the Land Institute, and they'll manage that process. There's an automated system for that licensing. It's essentially a trademark license agreement that says if you're going to sell the resulting grain under the trade name Kernza, here's the guidelines for that program. And then you are provided a list of approved seed sources. In the upper Midwest, with our first variety in 2020, we licensed 3 regional seed companies that include Albert Lee Seed, Minnesota Native Landscapes, and Brown Seed Genetics. Just to share Albert Lee Seed's website, again, don't go straight to them and try to buy your Kernza because they've got the same list of approved growers, but I'm just sharing this platform where it's available. They've also done some great storytelling on how and why they're involved with Kernza perennial grain, what is it, etc. And that's how you become a licensed Kernza grower. Sienna and Matt are dropping some resources in the chat that include those licensing guidelines and process. There's also a fantastic new Kernza grower guide. We recommend that you use it. I believe Sienna will be presenting at some point on the ECO program, which for Minnesota growers is supported by the state of Minnesota, provides both environmental benefit payments and risk management payments. So as Lee mentioned, in those early risky flights, it's good to have a parachute, right? So ECO is essentially that parachute for Minnesota growers. We can't eat the full cost if things go south, but we eat up to half. And that has been beneficial for growers that are experimenting with this crop and end up, if they don't have a good experience, we share in that burden. Okay, I'm going to shift gears to a quick just market progress. Big picture level, there have been more than 50 Kernza products released into the marketplace. I'm really proud of that. I think everyone involved with Kernza is. That has spanned everything from cereal, crackers, bread, beer, whiskey, pita, cereals, etc. About 45 of those products have been local or regional limited run products. And that, unfortunately, does not a large market make. We have had, let's say, I believe about 5 nationally distributed products that include a cereal, a blended flour mix from General Mills, and the Patagonia Provisions beers and recent beer campaign in partnership with about a dozen breweries. And so I just wanted to tell 2 quick little vignettes on this in terms of the progress we've made. The other week, an entity within the U of M came to us and said, hey, we're making a presentation on Kernza internally, and I forgot to order my Kernza flour. Can you get me some? And we started running around like we used to, trying to source Kernza flour from somewhere. And then someone wrote, hey, it's on the shelves at Walmart. So it was kind of this moment where we said, we've cleared that hurdle. We don't need to scramble for Kernza perennial grain flour because it's on the shelves at Walmart. So that's nationally distributed nationwide. And then the other little vignette I wanted to share was that my family came into town yesterday and they brought me a Kernza product from Michigan I've never heard of. So that was a really reassuring moment to say this is getting out there ahead of our ability to track it. So that was very exciting. Let's go to the market outlook. Going back to the release of MN Clearwater, we released that variety in about 2020. I believe about 1,500 to 2,000 acres went into the ground, half or more of that in the upper Midwest. And then realistically, we've seen a bit of an overshoot on production relative to the market. So we're in a modest surplus scenario. We have seen what you could call the supply coalition adapt to that. So there have been some reductions in pricing and also the onboarding of more milling and flaking partners. And then I think in a later call in this series, we'll go into much greater depth on current market pricing, products that are out there, and how you can work with some of the entities in this community. Just to name, in the development of the supply coalition, we licensed 3 seed companies. We've also seen the emergence of a grower-owned and led cooperative called the Perennial Promise Growers Cooperative. Some of their leadership is on this call, as well as in the upper Midwest. One of 3 distributors is a vertically integrated processor and food brand called Perennial Pantry that puts out fantastic Kernza products. And so we're excited to see entrepreneurship around this crop, in addition to uptake from major industry partners. A few last things I want to share with folks on the call here is that Kernza was developed from a forage grass, and the agronomics around this crop are pretty clearly guided toward dual use management for forage and grain. So I think Matt will lean into this further, but especially in the early commercial development of Kernza grain markets, de-risking through forage uses, either in your own operation, if you're set up to do that, or in selling forage to your neighbors, is really critical. And the other thing that will be covered in later calls is that public support available for Kernza growers has significantly expanded in the last few years, and we'd really love to see that public support better utilized. Through the Conservation Stewardship Program, Practice 328.0, Perennial Grain Conservation Crop Rotation, there is $175 per acre payment available for growers that are able to enroll in CSP and in that practice. For Minnesota growers and Michigan growers, also within the EQIP program, Environmental Quality Incentives program, also Practice 328, short-term perennial, was just approved for about $50 an acre. And within Minnesota, the ECO program can be stacked with either of those, is deployed by our program in partnership with MDA. So that's really the public saying to prospective Kernza growers, we want the public benefits in soil health and water quality from this crop, and here's the money we're putting on the table in order to help make that happen. And so like any other early stage technology, I really recommend the utilization of all this public support as we build viable business models around this new crop that's working its way toward commercial flight. And with that, I think I need to close, and I can take a question or two if there are any, and then I need to bounce.
Thanks so much, Colin. Appreciate that. Any questions for Colin before he has to drop off here? Again, feel free to type it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask that way.
Hi, I have a question. This is Teresa Pedretti. I'm with Albert Layseed. I often get asked, how long does it take for a grower to hear back from the Land Institute on if they are approved or not to grow? Because I think people have told me anywhere from a week to 3 months. That big of a swing?
Yeah, Teresa, that's helpful feedback. We try to work through new applications in Minnesota as fast as possible. We monitor the system. We also get applications from all over the world, and it's hard to work through them. So we do our best to have a dedicated person on it. This time that's Matt, and we try to make it as short as possible for our upper Midwest growers. I know you sell to a range of other folks though. So yeah, but we don't have a defined cutoff limit, but we try to do it as fast as possible.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And
Helpful
that's fair
reminder
to say
about
just
what.
procedurally that if growers outside of Minnesota go through the Land Institute for approval. I know you already said that, but just to emphasize the point. Is that right?
Yes.
Great.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, thanks for joining this call series. I'm sorry I have to run, but I'll hope to join the remainder of the calls in coming weeks.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care. All right. So in our last few minutes, with this call scheduled to end at 2:00. Can certainly keep it going longer if people have conversations they'd like to start or continue. I did, since we're on the topic of risk mitigation, and I just wanted to flesh out a little bit of what Colin had to say on public support dollars in the form of programs. So I also mentioned risk mitigation as well earlier, framed by Lee, but I did want to give people on the call, I'm sure many of you have heard of this program or are familiar with it, but just wanted to make sure that we did communicate that this exists. And this is unfortunately only for growers within Minnesota. But Colin mentioned those EQIP and CSP programs. Those are available to growers outside of Minnesota. And it is stackable with this program. Obviously, for EQIP and CSP, you'd want to go into your office quite early, sometimes even 6 to 7 months ahead of time to give the process time to work. And obviously, that has to all be in place before you plant the crop too, which is kind of procedurally something you want to think through. The ECO program is open right now. It's on kind of a rolling sign-up basis. So for whatever reason, anybody planted Kernza and didn't think to enroll in this program, you can still do it right now. And this is for new crop planting. So any plantings that happened in fall of 2023, essentially, or if this is something you're thinking about for 24, again, feel free to sign up. So this is state of Minnesota money, specifically to address water quality around the state. And it's not open to the entire state of Minnesota, but more or less it is. If you look at that highlighted map of Minnesota, those are all the eligible counties right now, but that pretty closely matches where the vast majority of agricultural production is happening in the state. And it's also been identified as places where water quality is either sensitive or impaired that a crop like Kernza can really help to mitigate, mainly through nitrogen leaching mitigation and those deep roots contributing to soil health metrics. So what the program entails is you sign up. We'll have a link for you to look at if you're interested. There's an ecosystem service benefit payment. And this is kind of us looking into the future and thinking or incentivizing growers for planting this crop to begin with. So that's just the ecosystem service that the crop is providing to drinking water and soil in the state of Minnesota. And you'd get between $20 to $40 an acre payment just for planting the crop, assuming it winters. If your farm is within a DWISMA or a drinking water supply management area, or very sensitive areas that goes into well water, you can get a little bit of a premium for that as well. And there's some risk mitigation payments as well on the back end, and we're willing to pay for up to half the cost of production on 4 crops in our portfolio that we're focusing on Kernza today. So that's up to $140 an acre. If the crop, for example, winter kills, or if the grain crop itself is unmarketable for various reasons, or maybe the crop has been stored for several years, still challenging to find a market, et cetera. All those scenarios would be a case where the grower could claim the economic failure payment and then claim that half the cost of production. And our goal is to get about 5,000 acres by this year, and our signups last year were about half of that. So there's still money on the table, and we'd love to see this program utilized even more. So if you have an interest there, I just wanted to make sure we took time to inform you all of that program if you weren't aware.